the mystery of the vanishing violinist. The night air was crisp and tinged with anticipation as the crowd streamed into the Grand London Opera House. Gaslights flickered, casting long shadows on the ornate walls adorned with golden filigree. The murmur of conversation filled the air as London's elite gathered, their evening attire a swirl of silks and satins, top hats and opera gloves. Among them were Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson, who had received tickets to the much-anticipated debut of Isabella Moretti, the famous Italian violinist whose reputation preceded her. Holmes, with his keen eye, observed the attendees, noting the undercurrents of excitement mixed with the subtle exchanges of the city's upper crust. Watson, ever the chronicler, took in the opulent surroundings, the lush red velvet curtains, and the golden tassels that shimmered in the light. As the lights dimmed, a hush fell over the audience. The stage was bathed in a soft glow as a solitary figure emerged from the wings. Isabella Moretti, dressed in a stunning crimson gown that flowed around her like a pool of red wine, stepped into the spotlight. Her dark hair was pulled back, accentuating her delicate features and the intense focus in her eyes. With a graceful nod to the conductor, she raised her violin, and the opening strains of Vivaldi's Four Seasons filled the air, the notes crisp and vibrant, stirring the souls of all who listened. The performance was mesmerizing, and Isabella played with a passion that seemed almost otherworldly. As she moved into the allegro of winter, the audience was captivated, hanging on every note, every movement of her bow. But as the final note of the piece vibrated through the opera house, the applause that was to follow was cut short by a sudden, unexpected silence. The spotlight swung back to the center of the stage, where Isabella had been a moment before, only to reveal that she was no longer there. A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd, turning into a wave of murmuring and gasps. The conductor halted the orchestra, and the stage manager rushed onto the stage, his face a portrait of bewilderment and concern. Holmes's interest was piqued immediately. He and Watson made their way to the stage, navigating through the chaos of worried performers and frantic staff. The police arrived shortly, cordoning off areas and beginning their inquiries, but Holmes directed his attention to Isabella's dressing room. The room was a small, elegantly appointed space, filled with the personal effects and instruments of the violinist. On her dressing table, amidst the clutter of makeup and sheet music, lay a single piece of paper. Holmes picked it up, examining it under the light. It was a note written in a rare dialect of Italian. With his extensive knowledge of languages, Holmes translated the cryptic message for Watson. The last string will break, and darkness will follow. The ominous nature of the note suggested a premeditated disappearance, possibly linked to a threat. This note was meant to be found, Holmes mused, his brain already sifting through the possibilities. It's a clue, or perhaps a warning. Their investigation at the theater would continue, delving into the backstage and the hidden corridors beneath the stage, searching for any sign of the missing violinist or clues that might explain her sudden disappearance. With the note in hand, Holmes and Watson proceeded to conduct a thorough examination of the backstage area. The atmosphere was tense, with the stage crew and fellow performers bewildered and concerned about Isabella's sudden disappearance. Holmes methodically questioned everyone, from the stage manager to the lighting technicians, seeking any observation that might seem out of place or unusual. One stagehand mentioned seeing a shadowy figure moving swiftly towards the back of the stage near the conclusion of Isabella's performance. Although it was a place frequented by many during a show, the timing of the sighting intrigued Holmes. Another curious piece of information came from a violinist in the orchestra who noted that Isabella seemed particularly nervous before the show, a detail that her father, who had visited earlier, seemed to exacerbate. Holmes decided to explore the understage area's labyrinthine passages that ran beneath the theater, seldom frequented except by maintenance staff or adventurous performers seeking solitude. The dimly lit corridors were thick with dust and echoes of past performances. Holmes, keen-eyed as ever, noticed signs of recent passage, a trail of fresh footprints in the dust, leading deeper into the maze of passages. The footprints eventually led to a small, seldom-used service exit that opened onto a narrow alleyway behind the theater. The lock on the door had been tampered with, indicating a recent and hasty use. Outside, the ground was still damp from an earlier rain, and the faint imprint of a woman's shoe was visible in the mud, heading towards the bustling streets beyond the alley. "This way, Watson," Holmes said, his voice carrying a tone of urgency. They followed the trail as it wove through the crowded streets of London, eventually losing the tracks in the chaos of the city. However, Holmes had gathered enough information to hypothesize that Isabella had not been abducted, at least not by force. The direction and haste of her exit suggested she was running towards something or someone rather than being taken against her will. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out all the evidence they had collected. The note, the witness accounts, the footprints, all pieces of a larger puzzle. As he smoked his pipe, the smoke swirling in thoughtful curls, Holmes began to piece together a theory. The note in Italian, Watson, it was a warning, clearly intended for Isabella, Holmes started. And her father's presence at the theater, the mention of him exacerbating her nerves, suggests a familial concern for her safety, perhaps related to her international fame. Holmes walked over to the map of London pinned on the wall, tracing routes with his finger. Our mysterious violinist was not merely escaping a threat, she was orchestrated in her movements, deliberate. It's possible she planned this with someone she trusts, possibly a family member. The picture was becoming clearer with each deduction. Holmes believed that the threat to Isabella was connected to a rivalry within the musical world, potentially involving another musician or a patron displeased with her rising prominence. The motive for her disappearance was likely tied to this enmity, hidden in the shadows of her recent successes. With a new day dawning, Holmes knew their next steps were critical. They needed to find Isabella to confirm his theories and ensure her safety. The game was afoot, and time was of the essence. Armed with his deductions, Sherlock Holmes decided it was time to visit the last known address of Carlo Moretti, Isabella's father. Holmes believed that if anyone knew of Isabella's whereabouts and reasons for her sudden disappearance, it would be her family, particularly her father, who had been at the theater earlier and seemed overly anxious about her safety. Holmes and Watson took a hansom cab to a modest dwelling in a quieter part of London, where Carlo Moretti was known to stay when in town. The building was a narrow brick townhouse, somewhat worn by the elements but maintained with care. Holmes knocked firmly on the door, his sharp eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement inside. The door was answered by an older man, his features etched with worry. Upon seeing Holmes and recognizing him from descriptions in the newspapers, his expression shifted to one of relief mixed with surprise. "Signor Holmes, thank God. Please come in." He ushered them into a small but tidy parlor. "Mr. Moretti," Holmes began, "we are here concerning your daughter, Isabella. We believe she may be in some danger, or perhaps she is avoiding some threat. We found the note in her dressing room, the one you wrote in Italian." Carlo's eyes widened, a mix of fear and resignation passing over his face. "I did write that note," he confessed, his voice heavy. "I had received letters threatening Isabella's life, anonymous letters that spoke of envy and retribution. They said her last performance would be her last in more ways than one. I feared for her safety and suggested she disappear for a while." "And where is she now?" Watson interjected, his medical instincts alert to this stress in the older man's demeanor. "She is safe, hidden away where they cannot find her. I arranged for her to stay with a trusted friend in the countryside until we could be sure the threat was dealt with," Carlo replied. Holmes pondered this information, his mind working rapidly. "Mr. Moretti, can you provide us with the letters you received? They may hold clues to who is behind this. Carlo retrieved several crumpled pieces of paper from a drawer and handed them to Holmes. As Holmes scanned the letters, his eyes narrowed. The handwriting is disguised, but the language used suggests someone well-educated, perhaps someone from within the music industry itself. With a plan forming, Holmes asked for Carlo's permission to use the letters to set a trap for the would-be assailant. Using his network of informants in the London police, Holmes orchestrated a ruse. News was leaked that Isabella would make a surprise return to perform at a private event, heavily guarded, at a location disclosed only at the last moment. The night of the trap, Holmes and Watson, along with a discreet contingent of police officers, waited in the shadows of the venue. As expected, a figure approached, trying to blend in with the arriving guests but carrying a nervous air and a keen focus on bypassing security. Just as the figure neared a side entrance, Holmes and the police apprehended him. Under the harsh gaslights, the man's features were revealed. It was a rival violinist, known in the circles as someone who had long envied Isabella's rapid ascent in the musical world. With the culprit in custody, confessing to his crimes driven by jealousy and fear of obscurity, Isabella was informed it was safe to return. Days later, she made a public reappearance, her performance more poignant and powerful than ever, attended not only by her loyal fans but also by those who had learned of her plight and supported her through the ordeal. As Holmes and Watson left the opera house after her comeback performance, Holmes remarked, "Jealousy, Watson, can lead men to commit the darkest deeds. But tonight, we saw how resilience and courage can resonate much louder than any threat." Watson nodded, documenting the resolution in his mind for later recounting, deeply aware of the complex human emotions that Holmes had once again navigated with his singular intellect and unique detective skills. The evening air was cool as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson made their way back to Baker Street from the London Opera House, where Isabella Moretti's triumphant return had been nothing short of spectacular. Her violin sang with renewed vigor, each note a defiance against the shadows that had sought to silence her. The audience, aware of her recent ordeal, responded with a standing ovation that resonated as a collective tribute to her resilience. As they walked, the streets of London were quiet, the usual din of the city subdued under a blanket of mist that added a mysterious, almost ethereal quality to their surroundings. Holmes, usually reticent after solving a case, seemed contemplative, perhaps mulling over the complexities of human nature that the case had once again brought to the fore. "Remarkable, isn't it?" Holmes Watson broke the silence, his breath visible in the cool night air. "How fear and envy can drive a man to desperation, yet courage and talent rise above, stronger and more inspiring than ever." "Indeed, Watson," Holmes replied, his gaze fixed on the cobblestone path ahead. "It is the perpetual conflict between the baser impulses of our nature and the nobler instincts that define humanity. In M.S. Moretti's case, the latter has triumphantly resonated, proving that light can indeed emerge from the darkest of circumstances." As they turned onto Baker Street, Holmes stopped and looked up at the stars peeking through the London smog. "Every case, Watson, teaches us something new about the human condition. This one reminds us that the spirit of art and creativity is indomitable, capable of overcoming even the most malignant threats." Watson, knowing the value of Holmes's reflections, nodded, storing these words alongside the many lessons he had learned from his friend and colleague. "And what of the vilest, Holmes? Will he face justice?" "He will," Holmes confirmed with a nod. "The evidence is compelling, and his own confession under the pressure of our trap will see to it that he faces the consequences of his actions. It is unfortunate that one artist's insecurities led him down such a dark path." They reached their residence, the familiar front door of 221 billion Baker Street standing as a silent witness to the countless adventures and mysteries they had encountered. As they ascended the steps, Holmes paused, a rare smile crossing his features. "Let us hope, Watson, that our efforts tonight have not only saved a brilliant career but also restored a sense of security and peace to a young woman who, like all artists, seeks only to share her gift with the world." With that, they entered their home, the warmth of the hearth a stark contrast to the chill outside. Holmes returned to his chair, the flickering light of the fire casting dancing shadows across the room. Watson, taking up his pen, began to document the case, ensuring that the story of Isabella Moretti, the vanishing violinist who conquered fear and treachery with the purest expression of her art, would not be forgotten. As the clock struck midnight, the soft sound of Holmes's violin filled the room, a somber yet sweet melody that served as a fitting epilogue to their latest adventure. In the notes that drifted through the quiet of Baker Street, there was a recognition of the trials they had faced and a quiet celebration of the triumph that had ensued, a testament to the enduring partnership between the great detective and his loyal chronicler. The case of the poisoned publisher. On a bleak and rainy evening, Sherlock Holmes and I were summoned to the residence of Charles Bingley, a distinguished publisher known for his profound influence within London's literary circles. As we entered his lavish study, the air was thick with unease. Inspector Lestrade, looking particularly troubled, greeted us at the door. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm afraid we have a rather perplexing case," Lestrade explained as he led us toward the lifeless body of Charles Bingley, which lay slumped over his desk, an empty glass by his hand and papers scattered around him. "It appears to be a case of poisoning," Lestrade continued, "and this," he pointed to an open envelope on the desk, "might be our most significant clue. It's a letter warning Mr. Bingley about a manuscript he recently acquired, one purported to contain secrets capable of toppling reputations in high society." Holmes picked up the letter with his thin, precise fingers. "The stakes were evidently high enough to drive someone to murder," he murmured, studying the contents. "We must uncover not only who had the means and opportunity to commit this crime, but also the motive likely tied to this manuscript." Our investigation began with examining Bingley's recent correspondences. Among numerous letters of typical business affairs, we found multiple threats that were cleverly veiled in literary quotations, indicating the sender was not only well-read but deeply entrenched in the literary world. Interviews with the household staff revealed that Bingley had become increasingly paranoid in the days leading up to his death, often muttering about a destructive power he had unleashed by acquiring a particular document. His personal secretary, a diligent young man named Edgar Collins, informed us that Bingley had received the manuscript only a week before his demise. The night he died, he had locked himself in here, claiming he needed to contemplate the necessary course of action regarding the manuscript's contents. Collins told us, his eyes wide with the recollection of his employer's anxiety. We next visited Bingley's office at his publishing house, searching for any trace of the manuscript. It was evident that someone had rifled through his papers recently. The safe where he kept his most confidential documents was ajar, the manuscript missing. To delve deeper, we decided to confront some of the individuals who might have been implicated in the manuscript. One was a famed novelist, Eleanor Vane, known for her sharp wit and cloaked dealings within the literary elite. At her opulent townhouse, she received us with a cool demeanor that did not quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Holmes, while it is true that Charles Bingley and I had our differences, particularly regarding the direction of some of my work, I assure you I am not involved in this sordid affair," she stated, her voice steady, but her hands betraying a slight tremor. Holmes, observing her carefully, replied, "Yet the manuscript contained information that could jeopardize your standing among your peers. Would you not go to great lengths to protect your reputation?" Miss Vane sighed, a flash of genuine fear crossing her features. "While I value my reputation, I value my conscience more. I did not kill Charles, but I know there are those within our circle who would not hesitate to silence threats to their own legacies. Our investigation led us next to a prominent critic, Henry Armitage, whose ruthless reviews had ruined many literary careers. Armitage received us in his study, cluttered with books and papers, the walls lined with portraits of famous authors, some looking down with visible scorn. Armitage Holmes began, "Your pen has felled more reputations than illness has felled elderly men. Would the contents of the manuscript have added your name to your own list of literary casualties?" Armitage's laugh was devoid of humor. "Holmes, you credit me with too much heart. I thrive on public scandal, but even I wouldn't kill for it. However, I know of others who trade in secrets far darker than anything my critiques reveal." This cryptic clue prompted us to reconsider the list of potential suspects, widening our scope to include those beyond our initial focus. Each interview added layers to the mystery, weaving a complex tapestry of envy, betrayal, and desperation. As our list of suspects grew, so did the urgency of finding the manuscript. Without it, the motive for murder remained speculative. We returned to Bingley's office late one night, Holmes convinced we had missed something, a hidden compartment, perhaps, or a clue overlooked in our previous search. His intuition proved correct. Behind a false panel in Bingley's bookshelf, we discovered a copy of the manuscript, hidden away as though Bingley himself had begun to fear its contents. "We have the motive," Holmes declared, leafing through the pages. "Now to flush out the murderer." Using the manuscript as bait, Holmes set a trap. He leaked information that the manuscript would be auctioned at a discreet location to the highest bidder among the literary elite. The night of the auction, we lay in wait. As expected, the murderer revealed themselves, driven by desperation to regain control of the damning manuscript. It was none other than Bingley's closest friend and confidant, Jonathan Price, who believed his entire career was fabricated within its pages. Confronted with his actions, Price broke down and confessed, driven by fear of ruin. With the case closed, Holmes and I reflected on the poisonous power of secrets. In our hands, the manuscript was nothing more than paper and ink, yet to those it threatened, it was a weapon more lethal than any blade or poison. As we walked the foggy streets of London, Holmes remarked, "In every person's life, there lies a secret, Watson. For some, the weight of it is too heavy to bear alone." The Hampstead Heath Ghost. On a cold, mist-shrouded evening in late autumn, the dim lamps that lined the winding paths of Hampstead Heath did little to penetrate the dense fog that hung low over the ground. The Heath, with its sprawling meadows and ancient woodlands, had long been a place where local legends and ghost stories flourished, especially among the residents of the nearby villages who were often eager to share tales of the supernatural. That night, an urgent message reached 221 Billion Baker Street, summoning Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson to the Heath. Mrs. Eleanor Hargreaves, a well-respected member of the Hampstead community, had written of a troubling phenomenon that had gripped the local population with fear. According to her letter, a ghostly figure had been seen by several individuals, always at dusk, weeping silently near the edge of the woods. The apparition, she claimed, was that of a young woman dressed in a tattered gown, her face pale and sorrowful, and her presence was accompanied by a chill in the air that was sharper than the bite of the autumn wind. Upon receiving the letter, Holmes, whose interest in the supernatural was purely scientific and born of a skepticism toward anything that eluded rational explanation, decided to investigate. He was intrigued not by the prospect of a genuine apparition, but by the human elements of the story and the psychological effects on the community. "Come," Watson Holmes said as he donned his coat and scarf, his eyes alight with the thrill of a new case. "Let us explore this ghostly matter more closely." As they arrived at Hampstead Heath, The eerie quiet of the evening made even the stoic Holmes pause momentarily. The fog muffled sounds, making the Heath feel isolated from the rest of London. They were met at the entrance of the Heath by Mrs. Hargreaves, who was accompanied by a small group of locals, each person's face etched with concern. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming, Mrs. Hargreaves greeted them, her voice a mix of relief and apprehension. "I hope you can shed some light on this distressing occurrence. Our peaceful community has been quite disturbed." Holmes nodded, his gaze sweeping across the group. "Good evening, Mrs. Hargreaves. Could you please lead us to where this figure has been seen?" Without hesitation, the group led Holmes and Watson along a narrow path that snaked its way through thickets and overgrown ferns to a more secluded part of the Heath. As they walked, the locals shared their own encounters with the ghost. Each story was different in detail but similar in emotion: fear, pity, and a curious sadness. They reached a clearing where the trees parted to reveal a small, tranquil pond. The water was still, and the fog hovered just above its surface. "This is the place, Mrs. Hargreaves said, pointing to a spot near the water's edge. "She appears right there by the pond. Always at twilight, just as the light begins to fade." Holmes walked closer to the pond, his keen eyes scanning the ground, the trees, and the water's edge. He knelt to examine something on the ground near where the apparition reportedly appeared: a small, silver locket, partially buried in the mud. Holmes picked it up, examining it carefully under the light of his lantern. A locket, he mused aloud, quite old and worn. "Watson, look here," he continued, showing it to his companion. "There may be more to this story than mere spectral appearances." As the night deepened and the temperature dropped, the group began to feel the chill that Mrs. Hargreaves had mentioned. Though skeptical of any supernatural explanations, Holmes and Watson couldn't deny the eerie atmosphere that the Heath exuded, enhanced by the fog and the isolation of the spot. "Let us return to Baker Street and examine this find further," Holmes suggested. "There is much to consider, and I believe that this locket is a key piece in unraveling this mystery." With the locket secured in Holmes's pocket, the party made their way back through the misty paths of Hampstead Heath, their minds heavy with thoughts of ghosts and unexplained tears, unaware that the truth they sought was far more tangible than any phantom. The next evening, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson prepared to venture back into the misty environs of Hampstead Heath. Holmes, having spent the day pondering over the locket and its potential significance, was keen to explore the area under the cover of night, believing that the conditions would replicate those reported during the sightings. "Nighttime may reveal more about our weeping ghost than daylight could ever hope to conceal," Holmes remarked as he adjusted the focus on his lantern. Watson, wrapping himself in a heavy coat, nodded in agreement, though the prospect of chasing ghosts did little to warm him against the evening chill. Upon their arrival at the Heath, the scene was as they had left it, shrouded in fog and silence, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the gentle wind. Holmes led the way to the pond, his keen eyes scanning the ground for any disturbances or clues that might have been overlooked in the daylight. As they approached the spot where the apparition had been seen, Holmes suddenly halted, holding up his hand for silence. Watson strained his ears and for a moment thought he could hear a faint, sobbing sound that seemed to emanate from near the pond. Holmes, lantern raised, stepped cautiously toward the sound. Without warning, the silhouette of a figure appeared through the mist, a young woman, just as the locals had described. She was dressed in a faded gown, and her face was obscured by her hands as she wept. Holmes and Watson watched in silence, the sobbing echoing softly over the pond's still waters. Holmes took a few steps forward, his voice calm and authoritative. "Miss, we mean you no harm," he called out gently. The figure slowly lowered her hands from her face and turned towards them. Her features were sorrowful, and her eyes, when they met Holmes's, carried a depth of sadness. "I am not here to frighten you," Holmes continued, keeping his lantern low so as not to startle her. "We seek to understand why you haunt these woods and perhaps help you find peace." The woman seemed to hesitate. Then, to the surprise of both Holmes and Watson, she vanished into thin air. "A projection," Watson, Holmes exclaimed, a note of excitement in his voice. "Clever, very clever indeed. Someone is using a form of lantern or projection device to create this spectral image." Intrigued by this discovery, they searched the area and soon found a small, hidden projector partially buried under a bush near the pond. It was an ingenious setup, likely operated remotely, designed to cast the ghostly image onto the mist. With the device in hand, they returned to Baker Street, where Holmes spent the remainder of the night examining the mechanism in the locket. Inside the locket, concealed behind a faded photograph of a young woman, was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it carefully, Holmes revealed a handwritten note. "Forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself." This locket and note, Holmes mused, belonged to the young woman in the image, no doubt. The question now is, who would go to such lengths to project her image, and why? The following day, Holmes and Watson visited the Hampstead Library to delve into historical records that might shed light on the identity of the woman and any events connected to her life and death. After hours of sifting through old newspapers and public records, they discovered a tragic story from several decades ago. A young woman named Mary Elizabeth Chapman, known to be a local of Hampstead, had gone missing in the late 1800s. Her disappearance had caused quite a stir at the time, given her prominent family standing in the community. Several weeks later, her body was found near the same pond where the ghostly apparitions had been sighted. The case was extensively covered, but no one was ever convicted, and it eventually went cold. "This Mary Elizabeth Chapman must be our ghost," Watson concluded, looking over the articles. "Her murder was never solved, and now someone is using her image to haunt the heath." Holmes nodded, his mind racing. "Yes, Watson, in the locket and notes suggest a personal connection. Someone still feels guilt over her death. We need to understand who is behind this haunting and why they seek to stir up the past now." Armed with this new information, they decided to interview some of the older residents of Hampstead, hoping to uncover links between the present ghostly happenings and the unresolved murder from long ago. The following morning, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson set out to engage the elder residents of Hampstead, those whose roots and memories might reach back to the days surrounding Mary Elizabeth Chapman's mysterious demise. They began their inquiry at a quaint tea room frequented by many of the area's older citizens, where the past was often a common thread in afternoon conversations. One of the first they spoke to was Mrs. Agatha Doyle, a nonagenarian with a sharp mind and clearer memory. Mary Elizabeth, poor soul, was a friend of mine, she revealed, her voice tinged with sorrow. Lovely girl. Her death cast a shadow over this community. Many believed it was no accident, that someone had indeed silenced her. Why would they believe that, Mrs. Doyle, Watson asked, pen poised over his notepad. She was involved with a young man from a very influential family. Oh, it caused quite the scandal, Mrs. Doyle explained, shaking her head. Her family did not approve, and neither did his. But Mary was headstrong, said she'd marry him no matter what. Holmes leaned in, intrigued. Do you recall the young man's name? Whitmore, I believe. Geoffrey Whitmore. That family has long moved away from Hampstead, though rumors lingered long after they left. Thanking Mrs. Doyle for her insights, Holmes and Watson decided their next step must be to track down any living relatives of the Whitmore family, possibly starting with local archives for any addresses or contacts. Their search led them to the Hampstead Historical Society, where old property records and family registries were kept. After several hours poring over dusty ledgers and faded documents, Holmes located the current address of one Richard Whitmore, listed as a grandson of Geoffrey Whitmore. The address took them to a well-appointed house in a more secluded part of Hampstead. Richard Whitmore, a man in his early 70s, greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Mr. Whitmore, we are investigating events that may be linked to your grandfather, Geoffrey Whitmore," and Mary Elizabeth Chapman Holmes began, observing the subtle shift in Whitmore's demeanor. "It appears that someone is using her image to stir memories of the past." Richard's face hardened slightly. "I knew a day like this might come. My grandfather, you see, was never the same after Mary Elizabeth's death. He always maintained that her death was not an accident, and he feared that his own involvement with her might have indirectly led to her demise." Holmes and Watson listened intently as Richard recounted family stories of forbidden love, societal pressures, and heartbreaking regrets. "My grandfather received a locket from Mary Elizabeth, one he kept hidden until his death. When I found it among his belongings, along with a note expressing his guilt and grief, I realized the depth of his sorrow." "Why project her image on the heath?" Watson inquired, looking for motive. "It was my doing," Richard confessed. "I hoped that by bringing Mary's story back to light, perhaps new information would surface, and her spirit could finally find peace. It was a desperate, perhaps foolish, attempt to right the wrongs of the past." Holmes, understanding the emotional burden carried by the Whitmore family, nodded slowly. "What you did was out of a deep sense of justice, albeit unconventional. Let us aid you in uncovering the truth." With Richard Whitmore's cooperation, Holmes devised a plan to lure out any remaining individuals who might have knowledge of the circumstances surrounding Mary Elizabeth's death. They arranged for a small gathering at the Heath, under the guise of a memorial to honor Mary, advertised discreetly to attract the attention of older residents who might still hold crucial information. On the day of the gathering, a small crowd assembled at the pond, the air thick with anticipation and the weight of history. Holmes and Watson mingled among the attendees, listening to stories and gauging reactions. As the event concluded, an elderly woman approached Holmes, her hands trembling as she clutched an old, yellowed letter. "I was a maid in the Chapman household," she revealed, her voice low. "This letter was meant for Mary from Geoffrey, but her mother intercepted it and forbade her from seeing him again. I believe it led to their tragic end." Holmes carefully opened the letter, which spoke of plans to elope and dreams of a future together, a future that never came to be. With this new evidence, Holmes and Watson were able to piece together the full picture of the young lover's plight, thwarted by familial interference and societal expectations. The revelations from the gathering provided closure to the community and the Chapman and Whitmore families. Richard, grateful for the peace brought to his grandfather's memory, thanked Holmes and Watson for their efforts. As they walked away from the Heath, Watson remarked, "It seems, Holmes, that sometimes the ghosts of the past are not specters to be feared, but memories that seek resolution." Holmes nodded in agreement, his mind already turning over the details of their next case. "Indeed, Watson, and it is our duty to ensure that justice, even if delayed, is eventually served." The Labyrinth of the Blue Sapphire. It was a crisp autumn evening at Harrington Hall, an estate renowned for its sprawling gardens and the opulent gatherings hosted by its owner, Lord Charles Harrington. Tonight, the grand ballroom was ablaze with lights, its walls lined with portraits of distinguished ancestors looking down on a glittering assembly of London's high society. Guests, adorned in their finest attire, mingled amidst laughter and the clink of fine china, unaware of the drama that would soon unfold. Lord Harrington, a man of considerable wealth and influence, had decided this gala would be the perfect occasion to showcase the blue sapphire, a gem of immense value and beauty said to have been owned by royalty. Encased in a specially designed glass display, the sapphire caught the light, casting mesmerizing blues across the polished floor. As the evening progressed, the guests were drawn to a scheduled unveiling of the sapphire, eagerly anticipating a closer look at the legendary stone. Lord Harrington, with a flourish, pulled back the silk curtain shrouding the display. However, the gasps that followed were not of awe but of shock. The blue sapphire was gone. The room erupted into chaos. Guests recoiled in confusion and fear, while Lord Harrington stood pale and speechless. The security team quickly moved to seal the exits, a standard procedure in such breaches, but the thief had vanished as if into thin air. An urgent telegram was dispatched to 221 Billion Baker Street, and within the hour, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson arrived at the estate. They were met at the door by a visibly agitated Lord Harrington. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming at such short notice," Lord Harrington said, leading them to his study away from the prying eyes and ears of the remaining guests. "The blue sapphire is of great personal and historical value. Its loss is immeasurable." Holmes, his expression inscrutable, nodded slightly. "I understand, Lord Harrington. May I see the scene of the theft?" They returned to the ballroom, now eerily silent, with only a few clusters of guests whispering anxiously among themselves. Holmes approached the empty display, his keen eyes taking in every detail: the angle of the light, the position of the display case, and the slight smudges on the glass that might suggest a hurried theft. Near the pedestal, Holmes noticed something unusual: a small, intricately folded piece of paper that seemed out of place amid the opulence. He picked it up with his tweezers, unfolding it carefully. It was a riddle, the handwriting elegant and taunting. "To find what's lost, start where sound sleep and time is locked. Follow the trail where numbers talk." Curious, Holmes murmured, tucking the paper into his pocket. "It appears our thief enjoys games. This, Watson, is our first clue." Lord Harrington looked on, bewildered. "Do you believe you can recover it?" "With your permission, Lord Harrington, Doctor. Watson and I will handle the investigation from here," Holmes replied, his mind already racing with possibilities. "This puzzle, though cryptic, is the first thread. We shall see where it leads." As the night deepened, Holmes and Watson prepared to delve into a web of puzzles and secrecy that promised to be as intricate as the weave of the sapphire's own storied past. Holmes was pensive, his thoughts already leaping ahead. For him, the game was afoot, and the stakes were as high as they could be. After examining the scene thoroughly and interviewing the remaining guests and staff, Holmes and Watson retreated to the quiet of Lord Harrington's study. There, Holmes laid out the cryptic note on the desk, under the soft glow of a desk lamp, and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "This riddle," Holmes began, his eyes narrowed in thought, "mentions places where sound sleep and time is locked. It suggests a silence associated with time, a library with its books, or perhaps a clock room where timepieces are stored." Watson, intrigued by the challenge, suggested, "The estate's library is extensive, and Lord Harrington is an avid collector of antique clocks. It would make sense to start our search in these locations." Nodding in agreement, Holmes rose from his seat with characteristic briskness. "To the library first, then. Time is of the essence." The vast library of Harrington Hall was lined with shelves that reached the high ceiling, each filled with leather-bound books that held the dust and silence of ages. Holmes and Watson entered quietly, their steps muffled by the thick carpet. Holmes went directly to the section of the library where older texts and records were kept, his keen eyes scanning the titles. Suddenly he paused, tilting his head slightly as if listening. "Watson, do you hear that?" he whispered. Watson strained his ears and faintly caught the sound of ticking, soft and rhythmic. Over here, Holmes motioned towards a large grandfather clock standing solemnly against the wall between the bookshelves. The clock was old and ornate, its pendulum swinging with a steady beat. Holmes knelt and inspected the base of the clock where, to their surprise, they found another folded piece of paper, much like the first. Unfolding the paper, Holmes read the next clue aloud. "Two hands locked at the first light of morning. Where books rest and whispers form warning. Seek the tale of a queen in her night. Underneath stars find the next sight." "The first light of morning often refers to 6 o'clock," Watson remarked, looking over Holmes's shoulder. "Precisely," Holmes agreed. "And the mention of a queen in her night is likely a reference to a specific book or story. We must look for something related to royalty or chivalry amongst these tomes." After several minutes of searching through sections of historical texts and medieval literature, Holmes's fingers closed on a thick volume titled The Chronicles of Queen Eleanor and Sir Lancelot. He flipped through the pages until a small key fell out, clinking softly against the wood floor. "A key," Watson exclaimed. "But to what?" Holmes examined the key closely. "We shall soon find out. The riddle suggests stars are involved in the next part of our puzzle. This could imply something located externally, perhaps a celestial observatory or a garden designed with astrological symbols." Equipped with the key and a lantern, Holmes and Watson ventured out into the cool night, heading towards the estate's observatory, a small domed structure situated on a hill overlooking the gardens. The path was lined with statues and fountains, their forms ghostly under the moonlight. Reaching the observatory, Holmes inserted the key into the lock, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was dominated by a large telescope, its lens pointed toward the heavens. Holmes approached the telescope, adjusting its position as indicated by the coordinates etched along its base, which strangely corresponded to the current date and time. Peering through the telescope, Holmes saw not stars or planets, but rather a specific point in the garden, the maze, illuminated faintly by the night sky. Within its intricate paths, a figure of a knight battling a dragon was just visible. "There," Holmes said, pointing. "Our next clue must be at that statue." The night grew deeper as Holmes and Watson prepared to delve into the maze, aware that each clue brought them closer to the thief. Yet the true nature of the game was still unfolding, wrapped in layers of mystery as dense as the fog that had begun to roll back over the estate. Under the light of a crescent moon, Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson made their way toward the maze at the heart of Harrington Hall's ornamental gardens. The maze, known for its intricate pathways and lush, towering hedges, glimmered under the touch of the moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows. As they approached the entrance of the maze, Holmes paused, his keen eyes scanning the layout. Watson, navigating this maze will require both patience and precision. The clue points to the statue of the knight battling the dragon, an allegorical representation of Saint George, I presume. With determined steps, they entered the labyrinth, the hedges seeming to close in around them. Holmes led confidently, his mind as sharp as the turns they navigated. After several twists and turns that tested even Holmes's exceptional sense of direction, they found themselves before the statue in question. The statue depicted a dramatic scene: Saint George, in mid-thrust with his spear, poised to strike the dragon coiled menacingly at his feet. Holmes inspected the base of the statue, his fingers tracing the lines of the inscription. There, cleverly hidden in a crevice, was another folded piece of paper. Unfolding it, Holmes found not only another riddle but also a small, intricately carved wooden puzzle box. The riddle read: "Within the beast, the prize awaits. Unlock the guardian at the gates. turn and twist the creature's scales. Follow where the morning gales. Holmes handed the box to Watson. A puzzle box, Watson. These are often more than mere trinkets. They require a keen understanding of mechanism and sequence. Let's see if we can unlock it. The two sat on a nearby bench under the gaze of St. George. Watson watched, fascinated, as Holmes manipulated the box, his fingers deftly turning and twisting the segments that made up the dragon's scales. With a final click, the box sprang open, revealing another key and a compass. The morning gales, Holmes mused, examining the compass. This suggests a direction east. We are to head east from here. With the new key and compass in hand, Holmes and Watson left the maze, their shadows long against the gravel path. They headed east, towards the estate's greenhouse, a large glass structure that housed exotic plants and flowers, and as Holmes suspected, the next clue. The greenhouse was silent as they entered, the air moist and warm. Tropical plants loomed like specters in the dim light. Holmes used the key to open a small, ornate door at the far end of the greenhouse. Inside was a room used for potting and storage, cluttered with gardening tools and old pots. On a rustic wooden table, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the glass, lay a botanical journal. Holmes flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for: a pressed flower and a handwritten note tucked between the pages. From Flora's grasp to water's edge, up where the dawn's first light does wedge, ship, seek the willow's hanging boughs. There you'll find what darkness dows. Recognizing the reference to flora and water, Holmes and Watson made their way to a small pond on the eastern side of the estate, known for its weeping willows, whose branches kissed the water's surface. As the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in hues of pink and orange, they reached the pond. The morning breeze rustled the leaves, creating a whispering sound that seemed almost like speech. Holmes approached the largest willow, its boughs low and sweeping. Searching among the roots and hanging branches, he found a waterproof container attached to the underside of a branch. Inside, there was a small, beautifully cut piece of blue glass shaped like a sapphire, and another note. The journey nears its close, but the gem is not here. Depth, seek the heart of my home, where secrets are clear. Return to where the Lord does rest. Find the blue within the chest. With a knowing smile, Holmes pocketed the glass and the note. Back to Harrington Hall, Watson. It seems our thief is leading us full circle back to the beginning. As they walked back to the hall, the sun's rays breaking over the horizon, Watson felt the thrill of the chase and the satisfaction of the intellectual exercise, yet he wondered about the identity of the thief and what awaited them at the journey's end. The early morning light cast a golden hue over Harrington Hall as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson returned to the stately home. Their night-long adventure had led them in a full circle back to where the mystery began, but with new clues that hinted the resolution was near. Upon entering the grand estate once more, Holmes and Watson made their way directly to Lord Harrington's study. The room was quiet, the earlier chaos of the theft now replaced by the soft ticking of an antique clock and the faint rustling of the morning paper in Lord Harrington's hands. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Doctor." "Watson, you've returned," Lord Harrington remarked, setting aside his paper with a look of anxious curiosity. "Have you made any progress?" Holmes nodded, placing the small piece of blue glass on the Lord's mahogany desk. "Indeed, we have followed a trail set by the thief, leading us to various parts of your estate and now back here. The clues suggest that the final piece of this puzzle is somewhere in this room." Lord Harrington's eyes widened slightly as he glanced around his personal study, a room he thought he knew in every detail. Holmes, observing his reaction, walked over to a large, ornate chest that sat against one wall of the study. It was an heirloom piece, beautifully carved and inlaid with intricate designs. "May I?" Holmes asked, gesturing toward the chest. With a nod from Lord Harrington, Holmes approached the chest and examined it closely. He noticed a small keyhole that was cleverly disguised as part of the decorative inlay. Taking out the key they had found earlier in the maze, Holmes inserted it into the lock and turned it. The chest opened with a quiet click, revealing several compartments inside. Holmes's sharp eyes quickly focused on a false bottom in one of the compartments. Lifting it carefully, he revealed a hidden space underneath, where the blue sapphire lay wrapped in a velvet cloth, its deep blue hues sparkling even in the dim light of the study. "Here it is," Lord Harrington, Holmes announced, handing the gem over to its rightful owner. "Safely recovered, though not stolen in the manner we might have assumed." Lord Harrington took the gem, his relief palpable. "But how? I do not understand why it was hidden here, in my own chest." Holmes smiled slightly. "It appears the thief wanted to test us, or perhaps wanted to draw attention to something else. This was no ordinary theft, but a game of wits. Now, let us identify the mastermind." Holmes and Watson spent the next few hours reviewing everything they had learned, piecing together the behavioral patterns and clues left behind. Holmes proposed a theory that the thief was someone very familiar with the estate and possibly even with Lord Harrington himself. After discreet inquiries and careful observation of the staff and frequent visitors to the estate, Holmes called for a discreet gathering in the study. Among the guests was Mr. Alfred Simmons, Lord Harrington's personal accountant and a trusted friend. As we gathered clues and solved the riddles, one name recurred in subtle ways. Hidden within the puzzles, Holmes began, his gaze fixed on Mr. Simmons. "Mr. Simmons, it was you who orchestrated this elaborate scheme." Simmons, caught off guard, initially blustered denials, but soon the evidence overwhelmed him. His motives were not greed, but a misguided attempt to prove his intellectual prowess and express his resentment over being overlooked and underappreciated despite his years of service. With the true motive revealed and the gem recovered, Lord Harrington decided against pressing charges, opting instead for a quiet dismissal to avoid scandal. Holmes and Watson, having solved another peculiar case, prepared to depart. As intriguing as the puzzles were, it is often the simplest explanations that solve the case, Holmes remarked to Watson as they walked away from Harrington Hall. In this instance, a man's need for recognition drove him to stage an extraordinary theft right under our noses. Watson, jotting notes into his journal, nodded. A reminder that the human heart harbors complexities deeper than the most intricate puzzle. As they left the estate, the case of the blue sapphire closed. Both looked forward to the tranquility of Baker Street, where the only puzzles left to solve were those of their next adventure. As Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson prepared to leave Harrington Hall, the early morning tranquility of the estate seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm. Yet before they could step out, Mr. Alfred Simmons requested a private word with them, a final gesture to explain his actions and perhaps find some solace in confession. Holmes and Watson followed Simmons back to the study. The man who stood before them now seemed diminished, his posture slumped and his eyes weary. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I owe you an explanation," Simmons began, his voice tinged with regret. "I have served Lord Harrington for over 2 decades, managing his accounts, safeguarding his treasures. Yet, I always felt like a shadow in this vast estate, unseen and undervalued." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "This game, if you can call it that, was my way of proving my worth, showing that I too could orchestrate something extraordinary. I never intended to steal the sapphire permanently. I wanted to challenge the great Sherlock Holmes, to make my intellect known. Holmes, who had been listening intently, nodded slowly. Your desire for recognition led you down a precarious path, Mr. Simmons. You sought to craft a mystery worthy of attention, not considering the distress it might cause. Simmons sighed, a mix of relief and sadness crossing his features as he confessed. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, and for that I am profoundly sorry. I realize now the folly of my actions, driven by pride and a misguided sense of ingenuity. Lord Harrington, having overheard the confession, entered the study. Despite the betrayal, his expression bore no anger, only a profound disappointment. Alfred, you have been a trusted friend and confidant. This revelation pains me deeply. However, I appreciate your honesty in the return of the sapphire. He turned to Holmes and Watson. Gentlemen, I will handle this matter privately. There is no need for further scandal. Mr. Simmons will leave my service, but I will ensure he is not left destitute. Thank you for your discretion and for resolving this matter with your usual efficacy. With the case concluded, Holmes and Watson expressed their gratitude for Harrington's understanding and made their way back to London. The ride home was quiet, each man lost in thought over the unusual circumstances of the case. As they neared Baker Street, Holmes broke the silence. Watson, this case, though devoid of malice, provides a poignant insight into human desires. The need for recognition, for validation of one's intellect, can drive even the most loyal servant to commit acts of folly. Watson, ever the observer of human condition, added, "It's a reminder that sometimes the simplest of needs, when ignored, can lead to the most complicated of actions." Holmes nodded in agreement, his mind already turning over the details of their next case. Indeed, Watson. Let us be mindful that behind every action, there lies a human emotion, often as deep and complex as the mysteries we strive to solve. Upon returning to Baker Street, Holmes retreated to his study, a new puzzle already capturing his attention. Watson, meanwhile, took up his pen to document the case of the blue sapphire. As he wrote, he reflected on the events, pondering the peculiar intersection of intellect, emotion, and morality they had navigated. The case of the labyrinth of the blue sapphire would remain in his records as a unique testament to the complexities of human psychology, a reminder that the greatest mysteries often lie not in the external world but within the labyrinthine depths of the human heart.